Good afternoon, or good morning. I'm very pleased to be here at this international forum, and I'd like to share with you very briefly some of our recent and not so recent thoughts and experiments and research in progress on climatic well health and the peri-urban linkages. So the outline includes my clients here in Manchester in a beat-up area. This is their objective. And we have four main parts: an introduction, then to talk about the urban and peri-rural, so-called, the well health and livelihood linkages, and some pathways. And this, by the way, is also my friends in southern India. So introduction, urban change, climate change. What do we know? Well, we know it's very, very challenging. Here's a graph which has really not changed that much. We are aiming for that kind of area, 1 to 2 degrees, but we're heading for that kind of area, 3 to 4 degrees. And as you can see, the consequences could be quite significant. Here's an urban area, looks familiar somehow. And here's a peri-urban area, which also this year, sadly, looks very familiar. And the health effects of this, go in all directions. It's a long, long list. So then we say, okay, that's not the only thing on the block. We have a COVID problem. And this little cartoon suddenly got very popular about a year ago because people say, what is the future? We just do not know. Where's it going? What shall we do? And now, this could be another lecture for another time. But just to say, yeah, we live in times of great uncertainty, great flux and turbulence. And this COVID thing, it's not over yet. And well, we'll come back to that at the end of our 10 minutes here. So then we say, okay, what about this peri-rural, urban peri-rural challenge? What's it all about? And we could say, well, it's not just one challenge or 1 or 2 or 3 in boxes, it's where they all combine. And the graphic shows something of a kind of big bad peri-urban and a big bad city in the course of exploding. So here we have urban and rural challenges, we have climate challenges, we have landscape challenges, social, economic, governance challenges, and of course on top of that we have the health challenges of both developed and developing worlds, so-called. I'm more familiar myself with the developed so-called world, the urban syndromes of obesity, allergenics, glucotoxicity of all kinds, which are then magnified through inequalities and what I call objectifications. I'll explain that in a moment. And then we say, okay, so what is the agenda here? Well, the urban-rural interface is often a no man's land: disruption, spoil, pollution. And if we are putting people in that peri-urban interface, that zonal area, well, they are directly in the line of climate hazards, flood, fire, storm, and so on and so on. And then it also increases the vulnerability of urban areas, disrupting food systems, water systems, transport systems. And it also adds to the health vulnerability, social inequality, exclusion, degradation of public services, and so on. It's a long, long list. So how to begin to understand? Well, we start, and this is our project, PERI-CENE, I think the link is somewhere. We start by drawing pictures with stakeholders, almost like, participatory mapping. But this is on flip charts. And then we attach labels to each part of the picture. This is highly interactive, as you can see. And we start to pile up the problems. And the more we look, the problems are everywhere, and they're so interconnected, really difficult to separate them and put them into boxes. But we try in order to get started. And we say, okay, we have different categories of problem. There is some sort of causal chain between them. Then we can say, what are the immediate problems? And then what are the more strategic problems, or synergistic even? And then also when we talk to stakeholders, it seems problems are all mixed up with solutions. So we have to say, okay, let's get the solutions onto that same diagram. And then we can start to be more analytical and build a systems model or a spatial model in this case. This is a diagram done from the European project on peri-urban some time ago. And the basic point was to say, oh, it's not just the peri-urban is there and, it's just like a load of houses in the fields. It's to say these are linkages, these are exchanges of information, of money, of people, of goods and resources and water, and so on and so on. So we can start to track these out, at least start to be a little bit systematic. It was only years later that I discovered, oh yes, UN Habitat is doing very similar things in their compendium. So I was really pleased to find that. Credit to UN Habitat, I have to say. And then we say, okay, let's try out these things on a real case. Now, Surabaya is one that we're dealing with at the moment out of our policy lab of 21 cities and regions around the world. And we use a mapping method with a global database. I'll have to explain that another time or send you links. But roughly the question is, where is this peri-urban? Can we see it on a map? Is it really clear to everybody? Does everybody agree? What is this peri-urban? So here we have a little typology. I would not explain in detail, but just to say, this is one example of a city or a region which has grown over all of the boundaries. It spreads in many directions in a huge, great urban mass, which does not even have a name. Asking my friends in Surabaya, what is this place called? Well, we don't know. There are different regencies and different metropolitan areas, but what is this place called? And where you see the purple and orange on this diagram, that means high growth, which then generally means disruption of water, forest, landscape, and so on. All of it shows on the next diagram, same map, but this is now talking about riverine flooding and coastal flooding and the loss of forest, which you see in the purple color, and in some forest gain, which is nice, but not that much actually. So, same old story, big bad urbanization, knocking out all of the, well, many of the ecosystems. Governance tries, but usually cannot keep up with the force of, real estate and infrastructure and economic development. This is the second city of Indonesia. So yeah, booming, obviously, quite. And why not? So then we say, oh, okay, could we then overlay our urban-rural linkage drawing to start tracking out some of those pathways, some of those linkages on the map, and then maybe start to overlay some ways forward. And I'll explain in a moment how these are generated and what they might mean. So then we say, okay, any other examples from around the world? Well, this is my hometown, Manchester, and this is a map of social vulnerability to climate change. A very interesting project called Climate Just, and the link is there. And you can generate, okay, so not only climate, but where are the people most at risk through a whole number of factors. Number one is poverty and inequality. Number two is health or occupation or housing condition, and so on and so on. So then we can also say, oh, here's another, my favorite example from Melbourne, from the 100 Resilient Cities project. And on the left here, you see a vulnerability analysis called Vampire, Mortgage, Petroleum and Inflation. And these are people highly geared. They borrowed to the hilt to buy that house out in the suburbs, but then they have to sit for 2 hours each way in traffic jams. And it's all really stressful. So they, get into bad stuff, alcohol, whatever. And then they get heart disease. And there's, it's a familiar story. What I found really interesting was to contrast that with the picture on the right, which is a more traditional map of poverty and inequality and exclusion for a whole bunch of different reasons. So the two maps are almost like a mirror image. And I thought, oh, this really tells us something worth knowing. So talking about health for a minute, well, health, livelihood, and so on. Well, again, we can say, in response, there are many potential pathways and opportunities for peri-urban development to improve the public health. If we can get our act together for sustainable local livelihoods, ecosystem protection, adaptation for food, energy, water, combined systems, and so on. And then talking about the health systems, what do they do in these spread out areas? It's miles to the nearest hospital. Many of the people, don't have transport, for example. Well, there are things that can be done, not only in the health system, but in food chains, in green infrastructure, and so on. But more generally, we have to talk about collaborative governance, public services. How can this be done, particularly in the challenge of the peri-urban, where things are spread out, they cross the administrative boundaries, it's no one's problem what happens in this place, and so on and so on. So we have to then start talking about the collaborative governance. Now, that would take another half an hour presentation for another time. But just a couple of things about health. This came from a project we did in the early development of these methods with the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. And well, you can see on the left here, people have to queue up to see the doctor for 5 minutes. This is actually true in this country. You see the doctor for an average of 5 minutes. And she or he will say, oh, what's your problem? Here, have some pills. This is, typical. It's not, I mean, doctors are great. Some of my best friends are doctors, but the system is kind of locked in. And it's also very much a servant of the pharmaceutical industry, which does wonderful things, but also has, a kind of dominance in the whole situation. So then there's an alternative approach. The patient is not just an object. The patient or client now is a whole person. And the healer, not just a doctor dispensing pills, the healer will take the life story of that person. I myself, and a patient or a client of these things. So that's the kind of cartoon version. Then we say, okay, how's that going to be achieved in real time with, the medical establishment? And yes, some cases are really urgent and some cases are, you have to fix a broken leg. I've had one myself. I'm very grateful for the medical system. But we also have to say what's going on here. This is one of the methods that we use where we draw the actors or stakeholders around the table. And this was drawn from our project in Glasgow about 4 years ago. And this is what they told us, or they put it on flip charts. This is what was going on. Everybody cannot trust anyone. Nobody knows the common language. It's all in bits. And the people who are supposed to be part of the solution, such as local government, people that they saw they were part of the problem. No one's fault, but that's the system was configured. So then we have to look for what is the possibility of change in such a stakeholder system? And this is not just, a reorganization of the National Health Service. We do this regularly in the UK, and things do not usually improve. It's more about finding the synergies between the different people around the table and then building either structures or programs on those synergies. So, and these are some of the pathways which then came out of that process of looking systematically at public health in this very challenged city. The average mortality is much higher than in other places for a whole variety of reasons, some of which are coming into the transitions and the change element. Now, again, this is a long story, but we can say, okay, if we are doing our future studies, our foresight projects and so on, we say, okay, there's maybe a socio-cultural transition about lifestyles. There's a techno-medical transition, bio-digital, genetics, artificial biology, and so on, but also an urban ecology transition. That's the most relevant to today's discussion, I think. And what do we mean by transition? It means a system change all over. So then we say, oh, okay, how does this system actually work? What's the metabolism of the illness service, as we call it in this country? If you're ill, it will try to fix you. If you lack good health, it doesn't really know what to do. If I have, depression, backache, headache, insomnia, the system does really not know what to do with me. So we have to then think again and say, well, how would a well health system actually work? What kind of learning would take place? And this is not all completely new. There's online communities, there's biomedical digital platforms, and so on and so on. So again, these come into what is otherwise a really big picture. If we then take some of that back to the peri-urban, and I've nearly finished, then we say, oh, okay, this is one of a whole series of diagrams which starts to try to track in space You know, space matters, place matters, as they say. And these are some of the flows on a generalized basis. This is the European case. It will be different in different countries. And some of the driving forces, some of the impacts, and then some of the spatial archetypes. Then we can go back to our urban-rural linkage diagram from a minute ago. So, oh, each and every one of these points is actually a health issue in some way or other. So that's kind of how the circle is then complete. Well, pathways, yes, we have a method. This is in the book, which is coming up. And the critical point is we look for the synergies as demonstrated around that table. In this cartoon version, you can see something of those synergies. And then we say, okay, what kind of problem are we trying to solve? Is it, you know, a technical fix? Is it some kind of competition or innovation? Or is it actually a transformation of a system? And that question is really key, because then if we return for one moment to the pandemics, we can say, oh, okay, let's just talk about this very, very basic stuff: hands, face, space, track and trace, in different versions, different system models. And I won't read the whole thing out, it would take too long, but you can get the notion. Yeah, if we are fixing a problem, it's like on the left, but actually humans are not just problems in boxes. Humans are humans, and we have to think of more integrated human solutions. And then for the other bits of the picture, the test, the isolation, the support systems, the treatment, and this list goes on and on. And then we can go back to our pathways and take each one of the challenges that were put up at the beginning and say, oh, do you know what? There's a pathway here because each one depends on and is connected to each other one. In other words, the peri-urban, yes, we can bring in the climate. The climate, we can bring in the health. The health brings in the collaborative governance, and so on and so on. And then we tested out on real case studies. Here's one from my hometown near Manchester, and it's a real place. And I can recommend finding this link to Incredible Edible, which is a lovely name for a fantastic set of projects. So that's about it from me, and much more in the book here. So if you can't get it, drop me an email, I'll send you something. And thank you very much indeed. Bye for now.